Good evening and welcome to Economics Unbound. I'm Peter Ndoro, and tonight we look at the social impact bonds in the South African economy. Well, according to Intellidex, social impact bonds, or SIBs, are seen by many as carrying the potential to revolutionize the way that some social services are governed, delivered and financed. Now, the first two SIBs in South Africa were launched in 2018. The Inclusive Youth Employment Pay for Performance platform, also known as Bonds for Jobs or B4J, and the Impact Bond Innovation Fund, IBIF. In the Intellidex report, they provide an overview of the financial and social performance of these two SIBs and assess whether the hype is justified, which we will be discussing later on the show. Now, food for thought on Nana, though. Are SIBs the golden ticket to better social services and better collaboration between the public and private sectors? And what does the experience in South Africa imply for the future of SIBs in the country and elsewhere?
Well, we all know that a social impact bond is a contract with the public sector in which a commitment is made to pay for improved social outcomes that result in public sector savings. Repayments to investors are made by outcome funders, usually the government, and are contingent on the achievement of specified social outcomes. The name was derived from the fact that investors in this mechanism are typically those interested not only in the financial return on the investment, but also on its positive contribution to society. A social impact bond is not a bond in the traditional sense, since the repayment and return on investment are contingent upon the achievement of desired social outcomes.
Well, if the predetermined objectives are not achieved, investors are at risk of not receiving a return or repayment of their capital. Therefore, they're considered to be risky investments. However, this risk can be mitigated through careful attention to the determination and the probability of achieving the targets and the selection and track record of the social service providers and intermediaries.
This financing mechanism has been found to improve both the effectiveness and efficiency of many social programs, which are usually managed by NGOs who are the providers of the social services. This is achieved through establishing reliable targets for measuring performance and ensuring that resources are allocated optimally to maximize the impact on targeted areas, thereby efficiently employing both financial and physical capital.
Well, 2020 was another strong year for sustainable finance, mostly supported by the issuance of social bonds and the rise of sustainability-linked bonds. It was driven by the COVID-19 crisis and climate change commitments. While much of the world's focus was on the pandemic, March 2020 also marked the 10-year anniversary of the first impact bond.
It goes without saying that 2020 brought a lot of challenges and changes to the world. These challenges wrought by COVID-19 have been felt most acutely by some of the most vulnerable populations in the world. Social impact bonds are an innovative way to achieve a return on the investment and simultaneously affect social change. But what is the difference between social impact bonds, known as SIBs, and development impact bonds, referred to as DIBs?
The key difference is that social impact development bonds, as well as or social and development impact bonds, SIBs and DIBs, are very similar in the way that they are characterized as results-based financing instruments. So in other words, the financing is provided to an organization or a business, but the returns that are earned on those contracts or on those investments are very much tied to very specific outcomes. Now, the key difference between that and a normal bond, whether that's a government bond or a corporate bond, is that on a normal government bond or a corporate bond that's issued by the issuer, the returns that the investor will earn on those bonds are set on day one, and there's no real link to a specific outcome.
Impact bonds have been contracted across 6 sectors, the majority of which are in the social welfare and employment sectors. In developing countries, the growth of the impact bond market has been relatively slow compared to the global market, despite considerable interest from global development actors.
I think what we've seen globally, not so much in South Africa yet, but very much globally, is that appetite for these sort of investment instruments has increased, very rapidly over the last few years. Asset owners and asset consultants and asset managers or allocators of capital are really taking their responsibility seriously in terms of achieving positive outcomes while also achieving, the required financial returns. So, with these contracts, very directly linking certain outcomes to the return being earned, a lot of investors are saying, but that's the sort of thing that we would like to invest in order to affect very specific change or very specific impact through the money that we allocate into certain sectors or certain investment opportunities.
SIBs are an idea, and most of the ones done in the world have been done with not with institutional money, say pension fund money, or certainly never retail unit trust money. It's been done with money that was grant money anyway. So maybe a big bank had some money they wanted to do into community development, and they were willing to put that money at risk in a social impact bond. But if it got lost, well, it wasn't pensioners' money. So there have not been that many in the world. They've done things on criminal recidivism, inner city redevelopment, and indeed education and ECD. So those are kinds of the small scale things. They don't have wide scale popularity. As I say, I only know of one that's been done in South Africa, which we did almost as an experiment to see if it was possible to do it and get our clients' money back, because we manage pension fund money.
Because DIBs have yet to be tested, initial investors are likely to consist of socially motivated individuals and organizations with an appetite for risk. That is, they're willing to sacrifice some, if not all, financial returns. So are DIBs gathering more interest than SIBs?
Well, absolutely, development impact bonds. I mean, if you fund a toll road or a wind power program, you put up the wind tower, the turbine spins, it produces electricity, and Eskom has to buy the electricity at a price. It's the economic thing. It's by a set of rules we are used to, and we can measure the engineering requirements, the offtake requirements, the revenue streams against the debt, and we could do an economic analysis of that we expect to get our money back. In SIB, is a much harder thing for us, isn't it? We're supposed to be not experts on whether the wind turbine will produce electricity, but whether somebody on the ground in a township can produce an early childhood development program. It's a different kettle of fish. So you really have to experiment with it to prove the point. Now, this is not unusual in the world of finance. If you think about what is now common with some very large-scale personal unsecured lenders, I mean, the Capitec's and the Ables and the others, who do provide a vital service to the community, albeit at a high cost of interest. In the 1990s, there was nothing like that. There were only loan sharks who were very dangerous people. You had to experiment to prove that you could make loans, personal unsecured loans, and eventually mortgage bond loans to the lower earning classes in society. We proved the case, and it was proven. Future Growth was early in that game as well. And so you have to prove these things first, and then maybe you get some popularity amongst other institutional investors later.
Finally, as the impact bond market has grown over the past 10 years, so too has the variance in deal structures that fall under the outcome-based financing umbrella.
So, social impact bonds, SIBs, have the potential to revolutionize the way that some kinds of social services are governed, delivered and financed. Now, the independent Intellidex research report funded by the Standard Bank Tutua Community Foundation provides a detailed assessment of the SIBs undertaken in South Africa to date, identifying the challenges and opportunities inherent in this innovative financing mechanism for social change. Well, to tell us what they found, joining me now is Dr. Zoeb Khan, and they tell us a little bit more about that. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be on your show. All
right. I'm fascinated that they're only 10 years old in real terms. We've had 2 in South Africa. Listening to what they're supposed to do, it sounds like something we should have been doing years ago.
Well, yes, but as you've said, they are relatively new instruments. So the first one is just a little over 10 years old. And in South Africa, the first 2 the implementation began in 2018. And in the developing world, they are really among the first. So I think that we're kind of leading this learning process.
All right. So how well did we do?
So So I think on balance, the two social impact bonds did really well, and they worked sort of as expected. So because of the focus on the outcomes, we found that in both cases, the NGOs that were delivering services and the intermediaries that structured the transaction and work with the service providers to help them with their delivery of services. There's a really strong motivation and rallying around meeting these targets and ensuring that whatever you do from a programmatic perspective is geared towards meeting these targets, because if you don't meet the targets, the investors lose their money. And as service providers and intermediaries, you can also suffer this reputational risk as well. We also saw that I think one of the people that you had in the insert just before me was saying how in lots of the social impact bonds in other parts of the world, we've seen that a lot of the money that comes into these instruments is money that would have been spent on social programming anyway.
Yeah.
So philanthropic money, for example. But in one of the social impact bonds here, we found that a sizable portion of the total investment did actually come from more commercially oriented asset managers who, if they didn't invest in the social impact bonds, would have invested in a kind of fixed income alternative that didn't have any social benefits attached to it. So that's really encouraging too.
All right, we'll talk about risk and that kind of thing just now. But what I'm curious is, the whole purpose of these is that they should come out more efficient and cheaper than if government had done the whole thing by themselves. Is this what you found with these two projects? Tell us how each one played out.
So different findings on each of the social impact bonds. So the first one was focused on youth unemployment. So the lead service provider here was Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator, and their aim, their objective of participating in the social impact bond was to demonstrate that you could provide employability promoting training to unemployed young people that is cheaper than the bulk of what is available to young people in the market now. So if you're a young person coming from a disadvantaged background, maybe a family that doesn't have a lot of household income, your route to a better future in the labor market is via doing something like enrolling for a degree or other expensive further education. So recognizing this barrier exists for so many people, Harambee said their intention was, can we demonstrate that we can do it a lot more cheaply and more quickly and get young people placed into jobs? And they did succeed in doing that. So they've demonstrated that it's possible to provide training quickly and cheaply, and much more so than other options available to young people, whether that's offered by the private sector or the public sector. In the other social impact bond, this was aimed at enhancing early learning. So the target was preschool-age children, and the service provider was the Foundation for Community Work in the Western Cape. And so their aim was to deliver quality early learning services to young children in their homes. And again, it's another issue about access and affordability. So many families can't afford to send their kids to like ECD centers or like grade R, which is like schooling. And it's not freely available to everyone, so you have to pay. So in this social impact bond, what they found was that to deliver really high quality programming actually costs a little bit more than what is currently offered through the public sector to young people. And so that opens up a whole debate about, and especially now that we're kind of in an environment of fiscal austerity, is the government kind of willing to be an outcomes funder for slightly more expensive services that are of a higher quality. So in yeah, quite different findings about efficiency on the two SIBs.
I suppose the good thing about these kinds of setups is the governance issues are better dealt with when you have these intermediaries and these evaluators in the equation.
Yes, so first, I'll talk about the intermediaries first. So they are really at the center of these transactions, and they kind of manage all the complexity. And these SIBs are complex because you've got outcome funders. So those are like government entities, donors, and philanthropic entities, for example. You've got investors, you've got service providers, you have outcome auditors. All of these relationships need to be managed. And the intermediary is really important, plays a really important role in doing that. And in addition to that, they help build capacities of service providers. So I think the vast majority of NGOs have never had to deal with a kind of results-based governance situation where all of your performance is geared around you've got to meet these results, and if you don't meet the results, then your kind of transaction is a failure. So the intermediaries help them to do that by doing things like introducing new M&E systems and just helping them to gear themselves organizationally into this very new kind of structure. And then, as you said, the outcome, the auditors, those are also crucial. So you need an entity that can independently verify that the outcomes have been met, because there is a kind of risk or an incentive in results-based structures for people to kind of overstate success or to be misleading about what they've achieved or not. So yeah, the auditors ensure that doesn't happen.
All right, so these are just two that we've seen and observed. But what do you think we've learned in terms of perhaps how to go forward? One gets a sense that there's certain type of projects that are probably better suited for this kind of intervention.
Yes. So one of your callers was saying how, or not callers, but previous speakers were saying how in many in social areas it's difficult to have control of what happens. So when you're building infrastructure, for example, it's kind of straightforward. You can set targets and you know that certain things will happen in sequence. So when you're dealing with human beings and like improving children's early learning or getting people into jobs, that's a lot more complicated. But at the same time, it's those kinds of things where you need to have experimental structures and trying out new things, and that's what SIBs allow. If you're looking for something to finance like infrastructure, it probably makes more sense for government to just fund that directly. With the SIB, the social impact bond, the benefit is that the government only pays if services are successful. And that can be attractive for governments and taxpayers in contexts like youth unemployment, where we've had very high unemployment for many, many years now, despite government and many others spending a lot of money and doing loads of things and not really knowing, what do we do next? So the SIBs encourage this kind of innovation, which the introduction of private sector investment can help to get started.
Do you think that the failure rate is lower with these interventions than if, governments and other institutions carried on the way that they've been carrying on?
Well, look, I think I'll answer that just by saying that I think what the SIBs do is because they focus on the outcomes, there's it's crucial that everything gets measured. So all SIBs do this. And so you measure what is working, because by having an outcomes focus, you have to measure. And then whether the program works or not, you have evidence that you can use to redirect resources to where they'd be most impactful. So you can stop spending them on things that you now know don't work so well. Or in the case of the two South African SIBs, you can say, look, we know now, we have evidence for two programs that work in early learning and in the promotion of youth employment. So how do we now, as government, kind of scale up these interventions?
Dr. Zoeb Khan, thank you so much indeed for giving us some insights on these two SIBs, and it looks like this is something that we might be onto. So thanks so much indeed for giving us your feedback on that.
Thanks, and the report's on our website, so have a look. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much indeed. All right, that's Dr. Zoeb Khan discussing their findings about the two SIBs here in South Africa. And generally, a good story to tell. And we'll unpack that a little bit more after the break. Stay with us.
The implementation of social impact bond projects begins when a commissioner, usually a public entity at the national or local level, identifies a certain social need and target population and enters a contract with the intermediary. After receiving the working capital needed from the intermediary, the service provider delivers a pre-agreed upon set of outcomes. The outcome measurement represents a key element of social impact bonds. The independent evaluator assesses their final level, and only in the case of achievement of the predefined social outcomes does the commissioner provide payments. In summary, the social impact bond structure transfers the risk of poor performance from commissioner to the investors. Investors receive a financial return for taking this risk, as well as a social return through the outcomes achieved. A similar context in South Africa motivated the launch of the country's first social impact bonds, also known as bonds for jobs, in Johannesburg in April 2018. Set to conclude at the end of 22, youth unemployment is extremely high, with the input-orientated skilling system seemingly incapable of delivering jobs. So to unpack more, I'm joined by Barry Panulo, Senior Project Manager and Innovative Finance Analyst from Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Welcome to Economics Unbound, Barry.
Thank you very much, Kanya. It's a pleasure to be here.
First question, what are the challenges of developing a social impact bond that's actually unique to the South African economy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So in SA and other emerging countries, really, we find challenges linked to the scope of development issues faced and the lack of track record amongst service providers. So as background, the first social impact bonds were used in developed countries, notably the United Kingdom and the USA. These are relatively well-resourced geographies where the outsourced portion of public services programs, be it job placement or the prevention of homelessness, are only required by tens or hundreds of individuals. The service providers in these markets, be they nonprofit organizations or social enterprises, also have more information on the outcomes or impact they are capable of achieving. This helps give investors confidence that the social impact bond is likely to be a success and repay their initial investment. Unfortunately, these assumptions do not hold as well in South Africa. Firstly, the problems are larger. For instance, whilst the UK only has a 5% unemployment rate, ours is over 30%. And running with that example, a South African employment-focused impact bond will be tackling a problem that is harder and needs to deliver change on a broader scale than that in a comparable developed country context. So this observation generalizes to other sectors and means that a lot of the programs that we're tackling are much more difficult to move the needle on. Track record is also an issue, and most South African service providers only monitor information on service provision. The lack of track record around their impact in particular makes it more difficult to convince investors to provide them with the necessary working capital to work under an impact bond.
Yeah. So what have been the main drivers and enablers for the social impact bond in the South African economy?
Yeah, so social impact bonds are intended to help government transition from being a buyer of services to a buyer of impact. And this helps ensure that taxpayer money is only paid to the private sector once it has made a worthwhile and verifiable contribution to society. So think more people placed into jobs, more people getting bachelor's quality matric passes and the like. So the first wave of social impact bonds in South Africa has been enabled by governments and donors being interested in supporting the effectiveness of public services and growing the involvement of the private sector in innovating new solutions to difficult social problems. On the other hand, investors and service providers, such as NGOs and social enterprises, have also taken an interest in social impact bonds. Investors like them because they enable their engagement in impact investing and allow them to contribute positively to South African society. On the other hand, service providers enjoy the operational flexibility that contracting on the basis of results provides, and they are also typically able to access long-term financing through impact bonds.
Okay, so you're an investment professional working to build a market for social investment in Africa, and much of your work touches on government involvement in innovative financing and impact investment. So what tips can you provide rather on engaging government or other outcomes on funders in South Africa?
Yeah, firstly, check if you're the right stakeholder to be engaged in government. Social impact bonds are quite expensive and time-consuming to establish, and they cannot work without having an outcomes payer on board. We do not recommend social enterprises, nonprofit organizations, or investors initiate these themselves, but leaders within government or large donor organizations are definitely well placed to initiate them. If you do find yourself needing to engage with government, first conduct further research on outcomes-based contracting and establish why it's the best approach in the circumstances. Secondly, identify where the funds to develop an impact bond or other outcomes-based contract will come from. And that also extends to the funds that you eventually need to pay against the results. If you've done these two things, then you're ready to engage with the relevant government stakeholders on your idea. At that point, you're quite welcome to contact the team at the Bertha Center as well, and we can introduce you to professional services firms that can help you make that design a reality.
Yeah, one more, Barry. During the time of, since we know that it's the time of COVID-19, so how rather negatively impacted have these social impact bonds been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic?
So it's a two-sided coin, really. On one hand, the social impact bond mechanism gives you a lot of flexibility so that you can respond to black swans like COVID more readily. You can tweak what the payment indicators are. You can look at extending the term of the project if necessary. A lot of the flexibility is built into the mechanism. On the other hand, it can be challenging to deliver a program that perhaps requires face-to-face contact in the context of COVID. So the fundamental assumptions linked to the design of the impact bond could well have changed during COVID. So we've seen this on some impact bonds where the service delivery has maybe had to be curtailed. We've also seen some other impact bonds where some of the metrics have been adjusted so that instead of, having people attend a physical ECD session, annual childhood development class, then a lot of that can happen virtually instead. So it really goes both ways, but the impact has been somewhat mixed.
Thank you very much, Barry, for joining us tonight here on Economics Unbound. And that was Barry Panulo, Senior Project Manager and Innovative Finance Analyst from Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship. That's it from me, and more from my colleague, Peter Ndoro.
Prudence, thanks very much indeed. Fascinating conversation there. All right, let's continue with this theme. And joining me on Zoom now is Graham Wilkinson, who's a social investment specialist from Tukululu Social Investments. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be with you this evening.
All right, so we've been talking about this whole SIBS environment from the investor through to the intermediaries and the suppliers, and ultimately government and institutions like that that pay for these projects. Where do you fit in that chain?
Okay, that's a good question. Thanks, Peter. And it is a long chain. There are a lot of intermediaries. It's one of the features of a social investment bond. I think that those who encounter this financial mechanism for the first time might be a bit surprised to see. As Tukululu Social Investments, we have represented a number of our clients who are social investors. And,
Right.
we've been participating in different SIBs. There have been, fortunately, more than just one or two in South Africa. It's still a very nascent sort of industry, or it's a very new sort of mechanism to our economy and to our context. But as Tukululu, we've been very fortunate to be representing outcomes funders. And as Barry was just explaining to Prudence a little bit earlier, the outcomes fund is quite a crucial cog in the entire mechanism. But there have also been one or two of our clients that have been interested to participate in social investment bonds as investors. But those most of our clients have traditionally, if I can use the word traditionally, in a relatively new space, our clients as Tukululu for the last 20 odd years have been more of those that are grant makers, philanthropists, and program funders. They're used to investing with the real objective of looking for social returns.
Right.
And they didn't mind about, in fact, they understood that once they let go of the money, it goes towards a social good, a public good, and that's been great for them. What's interesting with the social investment bond is it offers even those investors that are interested only in social returns, they can actually get some financial returns too. So it's a very interesting financial mechanism that allows different kinds of investors, social investors who've got different agendas and drivers for the reason why they get involved in social investing, to play a role and to play a part in this mechanism.
So do you think we're starting to get beyond corporate social investment and just philanthropy? Because now we're saying, look, I can make money and I can feel good about it.
Yes. And this is one of many different kinds of innovative finance mechanisms that are coming to market, and more people are exploring different ways of supporting initiatives. And Barry also mentioned social enterprise, which is a new idea. In South Africa, we don't have regulation that recognizes a social enterprise as you either a company, for profit, or you not for profit. That little space in between isn't quite recognized by our legislation, but yet people are exploring that space more and more and finding ways in which you can achieve both, get financial returns and also see fantastic social returns. A bit of aid with trade.
Right. So are we saying that this is giving an opportunity for more funding to find its way into these great social programs, whereas before you were quite dependent on a number of grants and donors, but now there's a business case, and so there'll be greater funding, and the end result is citizens and people in general are going to benefit at a much greater scale.
Peter, I think this is the promise of the social investment bond as a mechanism, is that it can help pull in commercial capital that's looking at returns that on the commercial markets, that wants to match or improve what they could get in a money market or in any other kinds of corporate financing type investments and vehicles. The trick, I think, in South Africa is we haven't yet seen that promise fully realized yet. We could perhaps talk a bit about that. But the whole idea is to be able to mobilize all different kinds of finance and to crowd it in to support the achievement of defined social outcomes. I think that's
what's it gonna take? Because I think when we start to go around the world, what we're starting to see more and more, consumers are saying, I will buy that product, but A, I want to know how it was made. I want to know where it comes from. I want to know that it's fair trade. I suppose, do we start to need to get that kind of consciousness in society that, you know, investment managers are saying, we can't just be investment managers. We've got to be socially responsible investment managers. And that way, we start to see the flow of funds.
More and more. And you'll see that there are even the sort of hard-nosed, if I can use that term, investors and investment managers are beginning to adopt ESG into their investing strategies to say, what is this investment doing in terms of the environment, in terms of social good, and in terms of good governance? And that's beginning to direct where money flows in the financial markets. Here we're talking in the trillions of rands. The social investment bonds we're still talking a few million. It's a very, very small part of the picture, but it is part of a bigger movement towards socially responsible and sustainable investing. Even people who are members of a pension fund are beginning to start asking questions of their trustees about where are you putting my pension savings? What is my pension doing towards helping the world with things like climate change, with even employment? It's not necessarily a big movement yet in South Africa. We have the pockets. Some would say the Sharia investing is particularly mission-oriented investing. But there are slowly more and more people beginning to ask questions, recognizing their power, even as maybe an entry-level employee who's just beginning to get your first paycheck. You are still making a contribution to a pension fund, and you have a say with where that money goes. And people are beginning to see that they have that power, and they can begin to direct their funding.
All right.
Their savings. Yeah.
So we're running out of time, but perhaps as a final word, there may be investors watching now, and they're busy thinking about, this kind of thing. What's the best way to get in? I mean, they probably don't even know where to start. Do they find someone like you? What do they do?
Yes, with these innovative financing solutions, it is best to find people who have experience working with them. I think Peter also mentioned, Barry early on was just mentioning how there is, it's a complicated field, and it's building up track record. So you definitely need to find a trusted advisor. But be curious and don't hold back from asking pointed questions. One of the things we're still trying to tease out about social investment bonds in South Africa is that balance between cost and scale. The one works against the other, and trying to get that right, because for some investors, it isn't right. It just doesn't make sense for them to get involved. So, find someone who's got some experience and get involved and ask lots of questions.
Great. Graham, thank you so much indeed, and good luck, and let's hope that this thing takes off fully. But thank you so much for giving us some insights this evening.
Super. Right, thanks so much, Peter. Thanks for the time.
Graham Wilkinson, who's a social investment specialist from Chikululu Social Investments. So this is a vehicle worth exploring and thinking about. I mean, it really can change the world around us if we think about where we put our money. All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll be talking to the former Statistician General. Remember the guy who used to dress in yellow? He'll be with us. Welcome back. You're still watching Economics Unbound, and today we're focusing on SIBs and DIBs. And this new revolutionary financing mechanism to get social programs off the ground. And we've explored the how and why they're a good idea, but perhaps what we need to explore now is where they're probably most needed. And joining me now is Dr. Padile Khotla, who's the Executive Committee member of the Intermediaries SA Scenarios 2030 and former Statistician General of South Africa. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program. Always good to talk to you. And when I see you, I'm always waiting for that yellow jacket of yours.
Well, it will emerge at some point.
All right, so these SIBs, they sound like a great financing vehicle and could, if they take off properly, be quite revolutionary. I suppose the question is, where should they be focused on to have the greatest impact on our society? And as a Statistician General, you would have seen the numbers speaking to you about where the need is. What do you reckon?
Well, I think even before we talk about the SIBs and the DIBs, what we have to really establish as South Africa is how do our policies interact, both economic and social, and how those interactions influence one the other, including the policies themselves. I mean, if you take, for instance, the squabbles in the ANC, they have nothing to do with the policies, either economic or social. But that's besides the point. The question is, where do we actually focus? I think there is no silver bullet. Everything counts. And all areas must be opened up, including, and especially including, the macroeconomic framework that for many years we have said is sound. So the SIBs or the DIBs, if, for instance, the macroeconomic fundamentals have not been opened, we'll still have the same results as we saw now, and the crisis will deepen. Rob Davies, the former Minister of Industry, DTI, has just released a book where he elaborates quite a lot on these macroeconomic fundamentals. Let me say what it actually is. We've, over the past 27 years, or at least the past 15 years, said our macroeconomic fundamentals are sound. I think what we missed is actually we ring-fenced the macroeconomic to a limited set of variables, which was inflation targeting, debt to GDP ratio, and a few others, instead of actually opening the macroeconomics to where it touches and where it is relevant, which is employment, or rather unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Those are three variables of macroeconomics that was left out of the Treasury mandate or Reserve Bank. They were left relegated to the Department of Labor, which looks at labor relations, not so much about employment. Central to the role of these institutions of the state that govern macroeconomics is employment, unemployment, inequality, and poverty. Matters that we have backed upon so many years, for 27 years, and they haven't changed. Why haven't they changed? Because they were not part of the rubric that Treasury and Reserve Bank have to pay attention to. We know that Biden in the US right now, he's brought the Reserve Bank and the Treasury to say, guys, we need jobs and we need full employment. And that can only come from those kinds of institutions. It's not only the financials that they have to look at, because if they are allowed to do that, they'll only look at the financials and concern themselves with that and not meta social policies and economic policies that are more liberating.
Are we saying that these SIBs and DIBs are evolving as a result of poor policy and poor governance and poor work by those that should have been doing the work in the first place? Because with this vehicle, they're showing up at the end to pay for things that they should have been doing.
Well, I mean, if we think about master plans and outside the macroeconomic framework, then we'll end up where we started, because the neoliberal economics is a gravitation to equilibrium. You can start from equilibrium, you will have disruptions, and then you'll gravitate to equilibrium. That's what the economics of CGE say. You've got to move towards a situation where we know that equilibrium is not a natural tendency. We got to do things to drive them to where we wish to drive them. And markets cannot actually drive us there. So if we don't temper the macroeconomic framework, we are not going to go far in South Africa, I'm afraid. And this has been constraining our growth. So we can talk about those things for as long as we are worried about debt to GDP ratio, which is just but ordinarily a ratio. South Africa will not actually get out of where it is, because at the moment we are saying we don't have money, as though government is a household. We need to look at where we should invest, but in doing so, we need all things possible, and every other avenue of policy must be opened, particularly the macroeconomic, which had been closed for a very long time. So policy discourse is important. And it's not the little things that we talk about like sips and dips. It's one thing. It's not, we got to drive these things from all angles, including social policies, which amongst others have to deal with the universal income grant. Which I think its time has come.
So as the statistician general, you would see the numbers, and the numbers don't lie, they tell the story. Do you think the policymakers use that information effectively to focus their attention in the right areas? Because I guess for us now, more than ever, we need information so that we could do the right things. And maybe you can just give us a few tips on what are those right things that need to be done urgently?
Well, I'm happy that coronavirus has started making policymakers to say that they use evidence. But there's very little evidence to show that they use evidence. If they did, we wouldn't be in this kind of situation on the vaccine. I mean, evidence on J&J, six people dying or having clots in a 6 million population. It's actually, you know, you are more likely to be killed through murder in South Africa. You are 30,000 more likely to be killed in murder in South Africa than being killed by Johnson & Johnson. You are more likely to be killed, you might likely 16,000 times more than being killed by Johnson & Johnson. You are almost 6,000 more likely to die naturally, more than Johnson & Johnson. So the question is, if it is Johnson & Johnson that causes clots and 6 people will die, surely we die more from other things than Johnson & Johnson. But is it then, the question is the question that Johnson & Johnson didn't do its work, and it suspects that it may cause more damage than the 6 in a million, in a 6 million. So this is the question. So the fact of the matter is, if numbers are used, you will see a different reaction to some of the proportions. There will be proportionality, there will be understanding of these things, rather than almost what appears to be a knee-jerk reaction.
Dr. Lehota, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and what it means is we're going to have you back to have a fuller conversation about the question that I asked you, but unfortunately it can't be today. So we're going to have to say thank you, and thank you for joining us. Always appreciate your insights. Thank you, sir.
No, thank you very much. I thought I had up to 9 o'clock.
I know, but it's got a shift swap and all kinds of things. Thank you so much, though.
No, fine. Thank you very much.
Right. Former statistician general, now involved in futurism work, and that's where we're going to leave the program for today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Economics Unbound. I hope that you learned something fascinating. So if you're an investor, perhaps a social impact bond might be the way to go. All right, that's it. That's where we say goodbye. Thanks very much, everyone. Good night. Take care.